gene and brain disease of
Yes.
Nietzsche's father.
Yes.
Did you publish your
It's
paper
coming
last-
out. That one's, yeah, that's coming out. I usually talk about them for a long time before I publish them, but there's something coming out in the Agonist in soon,
Yeah.
next month,
Okay.
next few months.
But that point really astonished me then when a year and a half ago. Did you? Still, I could not understand it. I think it's still harder to be accepted in my point of view. Did you have any conversation with actors working on
yeah.
life science directly,
Yeah, sure.
face to face, or
Sure,
or-
plenty.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah, I had some students and some people who were beyond students, people working in laboratories. We know the following facts. We know that Nietzsche's father died of a brain disease. We don't know exactly what it was. It could have been tuberculosis of the brain. One report is that when he was autopsied, a quarter of his brain was missing from having been eaten up by tuberculosis virus. Another report is that he had a brain tumor. But those are diseases that aren't heritable.
Yeah.
But he himself went through a horrific mental breakdown at the time when Nietzsche was only 3 years and a half old. So he was mentally deteriorating. So that sets up the possibility that as a primary caregiver, he was in a state of psychological stress and trauma, even during Nietzsche's fetal formation and in early neonatal life. Remember, and the whole thing ends when Nietzsche is 4 years, 10 months old, his father dies. So all this is happening at an early time in Nietzsche's life. So the question is, I mean, we don't know those answers, but when you read his autobiography, either he's talking about this or he's not talking about anything.
I'll read it.
Because this is what he says.
I should read it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what he tells you. The good fortune of my existence, perhaps its uniqueness, lies also in its fatality. I am, to express it in the form of a riddle, as my father already dead, as my mother still living and growing old. This double descent from the lowest and highest rung on the ladder of life characterizes me. I did not receive life from my father. I have a foot beyond life from my father. I'm as if a shadow from my father. Life in me only comes down through the line of my mother, and myself overcome. My father represents an opposition to aliveness in me, and I engage that opposition, and that engagement is what I mean by myself overcoming, and because it must have broader significance than just the personal act, it becomes a self-overcoming that signifies for the human race. That's what the book says. Up until now, people have said it's crazy, and put him in a mental institution. But epigenetic science allows for the possibility of a primary caregiver having undergone, in a condition of psychological stress, to have induced epigenetic changes in Nietzsche through what is called soft inheritance. Or possibly also, it could have been that epigenetic changes occurred in Carl Nietzsche before Nietzsche's conception that then infected his genes, and that the epigenetic changes were inherited by Nietzsche along with the underlying genes. That would be hard epigenetic transfer. It may not have happened.
The gene can be changed for in the next generation, but not by himself.
Why not? Nietzsche, of course you can. We have lots of indication that people who have gone through trauma can.
That's a brave, very, very brave idea.
We have a journal of applied clinical epigenetics that is devoted to psychological cognitive exercises that people who have undergone inherited trauma can perform that repair the epigenetic profile that they've inherited. The Journal of Clinical Epigenetics. Journal of Clinical Epigenetics. So now, but it's new. But do we have? But so those things don't have. They are. That's what we're doing. So they are liable to individual. So we have nutritionists. There's a lot of crap on this. It's hard to get hard science on because most of the. So you're right. It's hard to get the hard science on because most of the research has been in oncology. But we have all kinds of nutritionists and other people talking about, oh, suddenly now your evolution is in your own hands. Oh, you can think your way to a better body. You can think your way to blah, blah, blah.
But how?
A lot of which is bogus and nonsense. But there's an underlying reality that they're all dealing with, but that we don't have enough scientific study of to really know how to make it work. But I recommend the Journal of Clinical Epigenetics is clinical applications of epigenetics to people who have experienced adverse epigenetic imprints from their parents and what they can do about it that is not biological but purely psychological. That exists.
Aside of this part, I really like your paper about the justice for non-human others. It's really good paper.
Thank you.
Yeah. But what's the difference? Like, if you had a patient and you gave them a placebo for maybe a disease or some problem they have, so they're taking a placebo thinking it's gonna cure them, and eventually they do get cured. And on the other hand, you have something where someone actually is aware of the problem and they decide to tackle the problem themselves.
You might not be able to tell. Right, because we're not really going to know anything until we map the epigene. I mean, I have to be able to take Audrey Hepburn is a famous American actress. She was very beautiful and very unusual, thin features. She had those features because she was a survivor of the hunger famine. Of the famine that the Nazis imposed in World War II. Those changes occurred in her as epigenetic effects. Unless and until we can map the epigenome in the way that we've been able to map DNA and be able to point to what genes were down-regulated or upregulated as a result of the trauma of her mother going through the starvation, and we're not really going to have concrete answers. But that's not the issue. The issue is whether we can get concrete answers in order for the theory to be meaningful. If there were no possibility of concrete answers, then that's a different scenario. But we're not in that scenario. We're in the early stages of epigenetic science. In 2005, all we thought epigenetics did was account for how cells differentiated into being heart cells and lung cells and skin cells when after something called the zygote was formed after conception. That's what first happens, the ball cells, and they're undifferentiated. We knew there had to be a mechanism for cell differentiation, and we thought that was epigenetics. And that's all we knew about it from 2005. So the amount of research it's very recent. It's extraordinary. So you don't have the answers to those questions. And we're not looking into it sufficiently. We're working on oncology and curing diseases. Because we're sort of, so the theoretical side of it that concerns immediate heritability from trauma to a parent as affecting the child, or the broader problem of epigenetic evolution, like Peter Ward is discussing, and how epigenetic changes are conserved across evolutionary time. We know they are. We know that methylation patterns that imposed themselves thousands of years ago are conserved across evolutionary time. I wouldn't know how we could change any of those by thinking about it, but theoretically we could change it if we could find the markers and change the chemical coding. But trauma might be changeable in some cases. That's what we're getting. But it's not significant. It won't be significant until we until we map it. And we say, here's the genes that are being screwed with because of your trauma that you were subjected to when you were forming as a human being and in neonatal life. And now we can change those regulation patterns, and now you will be a different person. You will have a different mental life. You won't have depression, for instance. Almost certainly, we were watching how depression was running through families from one generation to another for a long time. Mm-hmm. Now we almost certainly know that that's all because of the inheritance of epigenetic regulations. Well, we don't know how to get to the epigenetics to change it, but we know that that's where the problem is. So it's not. So we used to think that depression was a result of serotonin levels in your brain and not working right and so on, but that's all being regulated by epigenetics, and that's why it's heritable.
But how come, like in this case, for example, like especially in this generation, like had like the highest record of depression in?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I have my ideas. Let's be president in America. That help my happy outlook on the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Chong. It's very interesting paper that I agree with some ideas, like authority is kind of being afraid of. And
you see that?
Yeah, and the second is that we involved into a business. Yeah, but
yeah.
I still have several questions or maybe just a disagreement. The first thing is that you think maybe in the very first stage of the human beings, people is born with kind of how to say starvation, right? And then we find that we are how to say maybe at that time, I mean just in the very beginning days, people were you mean you use the word self-direction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think maybe self-direction is not something, I mean, appearing that time. Maybe it's the thing people find from their society, maybe after the going to the agricultural society or maybe the industrial society. It's not the thing, how to say, came out at the very beginning. It's a thing people find from the, I'd say, later life, right?
But what we're seeing in agriculture is very, what we saw with agriculture was changes in relationships to women, children, and nature.
Yeah.
So it became possible for women to have more children than they used to have because of that time. And all of that is because agriculture is very, 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 very labor intensive. That's the issue.
I mean, for example, like in the primitive society, people still, I mean, were under the control of the business and the control of the authority, right? I mean, authority is not a thing.
In the New Era, in the South Sudan, they wouldn't know what obedience meant.
So they don't know,
but no concept of it. They have no leaders. They've never had leaders. They've been this way for their entire history. No leaders, no rules. That's why Evans Pritchard wrote a book on African political systems. How can you have an anarchic political system?
I mean, even in some places, Switzerland, maybe people are kind of associated by maybe another kind of power, for example, maybe a kind of god. It's just not a political leader, but still in the control of other authority. So I just want to say
Could be.
Yeah,
Then the answer-
self-direction
the
is
answer to
not
that
the thing that you can
could be.
find from the
The,
other
an-
state.
the answer to that is how distinctively we can identify what we're calling the psychology of fascism.
Yeah.
And all those rich details are in Reich's books. And you don't really see that. I mean, you're not seeing this kind of stuff. You're not seeing all this hatred of LGBT Jews, and you're not seeing hatred of women. You're not seeing these toxic self-individualisms outside of this setting. It had to come from somewhere. But you're right, we don't have the answers. But if there's such a thing as comparative evolution, which there wasn't when I was born, there's only one pattern of evolution, and that was Darwinian. If there's room to talk about comparative evolution, then that has to be the way to start thinking about these things.
Okay, yeah, I just, it's the thought. And my second disagreement is your idea about the U.S. I think you are kind of like not very, how to say, happy or
I'm not happy.
not about the situation of the U.S.
No,
now.
because all the people that he's shooting in the face
You're-
are all my friends.
You're too very impressive,
Hmm?
I mean, for example, you think the U.S. is going to kind of fascism
Yeah.
by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But I just want to say that if you just use your idea about the starvation and your idea about the authority, because I think now maybe people are not a fear of the starvation, but starvation is kind of instead of by other things. For example,
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
right? The
Yeah.
happy life, the
Yeah.
better quality.
Yeah,
of
we're not
life.
worried. Yeah, obviously, no one is worried about starving. But my reconstruction starts with this fear of starvation, and then moves to the thought that we gave up the competencies of individualized adaptation to address that circumstance, and shifted to obedience. But that because we gave up addressing that fear, original fear, with individualized experiences, the fear remained with us. But now we can't. We've now completely immobilized individualized responses to anything. So now everything, it's not just enough, so even though we're not starving here, the whole capacity for individualization has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
It can't just have, something like that can't have just evolved under Darwinian mechanisms. It's too anti-life. It has absolutely the contrary of any survival potential. So it had to have come from something outside of the normal course of events. It has to be the effective trauma.
Yeah, so I want to ask one more question as well. Why you think people, especially Americans, are losing the capacity of self-direction or self-domination?
Well, I don't know. I think we don't know. We do know that as this whole thing continues, the epigenetic profiles that are generating a certain civilization, a certain social society, are then being reinforced by it in a kind of reinforcing feedback loop. So things could be getting, but how it exactly happened in the United States is, I can tell you, here are people who were marginalized for my entire lifetime, and I mean, we're talking bikers who are terrible racists and low-life people. And we're talking very uneducated people who were, and conspiracy theorists who were the extreme margin of the political spectrum. But television commentators started appearing, like Rush Limbaugh and Pat Robinson, and they started feeding these conspiracy theories to them. And all of a sudden, that relatively minor group of people got bigger. So the mechanism for doing it was, the political mechanism that Republicans used to do it is known. And they did it through TV and through Glenn Beck and those people. So they influenced, they just enlarged that base, and now Donald Trump has 35% solid support.
So will he
Yes.
succeed in the
Yes.
next?
The worst scenario that I can imagine is the following. I think that this is my nightmare future. Newsflash from the future. It is now the end of November 2020.
Yeah.
1 year from now, a little over a year from now. What happened is that Donald Trump lost the popular vote just the way he did in 2016. But he also lost the Electoral College vote, but not by much. He only lost it by a couple of votes. Because he only lost it by a couple of votes, he's decided that the Republicans were responsible for, Democrats were responsible for fooling and influencing the elections. This is all fantasy. Here at the end of November, 10,000 of MAGNA supporters wearing MAGNA hats marched on Washington with automatic weapons, see, to say unless somehow or another Donald Trump is put into the presidency, we will, that's where this is going, and that's fascism. That's what I'm afraid will happen. And I'm very afraid that will happen. That's a very possible scenario, and everyone I talk to in America is afraid that will happen.
Okay, more questions?
So if not Trump, who is the likely president?
I think it will be Trump.
Nobody.
Still Trump.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure Trump is going to win.
Yeah.
Yep.
Horrible.
Yeah, we all sort of think that. The impeachment is just meaningless.
Yeah.
It's just because it doesn't affect any, because because of that power base, because of the Marx-Freud synthesis, because they're too irrational for that to mean anything. It's irrationalism in politics. That's the essence of fascism.
But Trump is trying to, address many men's, the, how to say, threat of starvation and maybe like job or better life or higher education just for the white natives, not for the black.
Yeah, but it doesn't really, but you can't do that. But also, it didn't, huh?
We will build a wall.
Yeah, right. But also, he didn't really do that, because under Obama, Obama was thought that the fact that 40 million Americans didn't have health care was a scam. And then we covered them, and now they're gone. Do you hear about what happened? No. We never hear in news reports what happened to those 40 million people. They're not covered. Well, I went to the hospital and my Obama coverage wasn't good anymore, and I couldn't get drugs for my wife, who then died. Who would not have died under, we're not hearing about those cases, but I'm sure they exist. So he's not really doing anything. So it's that's the whole point. That's the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
Rational self-interest is not working.
Yeah.
If it was working, we could be Marxists. Because Marx is an Enlightenment thinker.
Yeah. Marx is like that.
So it's because that's not working that we extended over to the study of Freudian foundations of the irrationality in politics of authoritarianism. So these people are voting for someone against their self-interest. It's insanity. What's the deal?
Okay, we still have about 5 minutes. Any more questions?
Yeah.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying.
But I know many white men. I just did a kind of survey last year when I was in the Princeton University, and many native white men were very believe Donald Trump, because they think Donald Trump will give them kind of new life. And the thing, Obama did nothing in the 80 years. So they want to.
That's certainly true. It is. I mean, there's still. I don't know how. I don't know the people you're talking to at Princeton are not his support base. The people who,
Actually, Princeton is kind of the base of the Democrats.
yeah,
But, after the 8 years of the Obama, right?
yeah,
Many white men,
sure.
don't like the Democrats
Sure.
anymore.
You might be talking to his support. Trump's support is lower middle class.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and some
He
white
keeps saying,
conservatives.
Steve Bannon said, well, the Republicans are the party of the working class. That's not really true. It's the lower middle class. That's clear and right.
Yeah.
Because we're studying the Marx-Freud synthesis. Now, how did the lower middle class become so important in the rise of fascism? And it's because of the role of the lower middle class in the economic system. Whereas the working class doesn't have it. So the lower middle class has always been identified as more profoundly authoritarian. So you might be talking to middle class or upper middle class, probably mobile, or people who have some expectations for their lives, who have this or that or the other idea about Donald Trump. But the 35% of people who are staying with him for anything, and people who produce this kind of video, those are coming from this extreme authoritarian mentality that's characteristic of the lower middle class, not the middle class.
So, starvation is dominating the no middle class.
Something. I mean, it's
kind
not
of
starvation.
starvation,
It's the claim. I can't. My innovation was to say I'm not going to sit and be content with listening to Reich tell me that there's a fear of freedom and craving to be led in the mind of the authoritarian, because I cannot understand how we could have evolved to be that way. It's unthinkable. So we must revisit the mechanisms of revolution and find out where in the evolutionary record that happened and why it doesn't exist everywhere. And that's the general thrust of my paper. And only since Peter Ward's book in 2018 have we begun to get the idea that epigenetic effects accelerate at the end of catastrophes. I've never read that before Peter Ward's book. So if that's the case, then what we're looking at is the techniques and intelligences of evolution, of agriculture being epigenetic effects, but I think that also that must have been supported by obedience to make evolution, to make agriculture work. And that must be where we're starting. So, and if I look for where's the fear in there, it can only be fear of starvation. So it must be derivative ultimately, by some machinery of. There must be go back to fear of starvation. Why would you have fear of being autonomous? Where does that come from? It has to have. So we don't get that in Reich.
Yeah.
Reich doesn't tell us where we get to fate of autonomy. No one does.
Yeah.
Fear of autonomy and the betrayal of the self. Well, where does it come from in the human mind? It's just pop into existence. And why don't we have it in other parts of the world? And why do we have Native Americans looking at Europeans saying, what's the deal with you? Why are you like this? Why did you kill all the buffaloes? And why we can't stand anything about you? With all this hatred and violence and these terrible things you're doing to us. What is wrong with you? Okay? So that has to come out of someplace, and that's why I think that epigenetic evolution is the thing of our time. It introduces the unbelievable theory of comparative evolution and cultural foundations of evolution, but it also introduces the idea of epigenetics, because that's what we have to say, dear Donald Trump. Here is Dr. Steinbuck's Epigenetic Center, and here is a firing squad. And either you get into it, or we're going to get you out of the species because you're too toxic.
Yeah. So maybe
And that's not
the
democracy.
younger Mars comet didn't impact the Earth. Maybe we're not the situation.
Maybe not, but it coincides with the rise of agriculture.
Yeah.
So that's it. So we're looking at, so I don't, this is on the phosphorus, so I'm just piecing together a structure that, I don't have the details, but it looks like something like that is what's going on. See, and that's just a strand of human beings with extreme intelligences and extreme competencies. Then became the dominant planetary culture, and we have massive populations and all this stuff. but we also have so much craziness in it. And civilizations that remain predominantly Darwinian may not have produced a Beethoven or a Botticelli, but nonetheless, and that may be our situation as human beings. Take your choice. Do you want to be brilliantly epigenetic and nuts, or do you want to be rather mundane, but under Darwinianism, but still pretty much like a civil human being to one another?
Yeah, yeah.
See, that's an extraordinary